Okay, today we're talking about the KTM 65. Don't turn this video off if you have a 2021 model. I know this looks like a little bit older 65. It's a 2014. This engine has been the same since 2009. So even if you have a 21, a 19, a 18, this will be a great video to get you familiar with the bike and show you a few things that will be very helpful if you own one of these. If you just purchased one, if you just got one, I wish someone would have made a video like this before. When we first got ours, we learned a lot. We've had this bike 4 or 5 years now. 2 kids have raced it, ridden it. It's a great bike. It's great for racing. It's also a pretty smooth bike, even just for learning on. If you've got a younger child that wants to learn, this is a pretty smooth bike once you jet it correctly. So it's been a great bike. Again, 2009 to 2021 and probably beyond, this will be helpful. Here's a couple of the topics that we're going to go through just to get you familiar with the bike, show you a few things that maybe will help you as you're getting this ready for your son or daughter to ride. So let's jump right into it with the jetting. So really quickly, the jetting on this bike, the biggest thing that I found that helped is getting the jet kit from Tusk, or Nihilo makes the same jet kit. And the reason for that is not necessarily for the main and the pilot, but for that needle valve, or that needle jet, sorry. That needle jet, there you can see right there, it's a 15 and 1.3. Seemed to smooth out the bike quite a bit and make help a little bit. So I would definitely recommend that needle, and that's anywhere from sea level to 4,500 feet where we rode this bike, anywhere in between. That needle seemed to work well. Beyond that, as far as the pilot and the main, I know it comes with a bigger pilot, a bigger main. I honestly, my opinion on that is to use the owner's manual for the temperature and the elevation, and use the correct main and pilot. When I went with that bigger pilot, we were fouling spark plugs a lot worse than we normally do, and you're going to foul a lot of spark plugs on this bike anyway. So I've always, a good place to start for sure would just be the manual, and using the pilot and the main that they recommend on that. And that seemed to work out well. Okay, another thing that'll help on this bike with the jetting, besides the correct jets, the correct needle, pilot, main, is KTM makes a longer air screw. You can see it back in there. It's that brass screw, and it protrudes out of the carburetor a little bit. Easier to adjust. You may need to loosen the bands on the carburetor and rotate the carburetor down or towards you on this side of the bike where the shock is. But once you do that, then you can easily adjust that air screw. Start with the settings on the air screw that the manual recommends. You shouldn't have to mess with it too much, but if you do, that air screw helps quite a bit. So if you got the right pilot jet in there, you hopefully won't foul as many spark plugs, but you're still going to be fouling spark plugs. One thing I definitely recommend is, especially before a race, either change out the spark plug or at the very least clean that spark plug. We had one race where we fouled the plug right on the start line right before the race, and obviously you don't want your son or daughter screaming at the start line, jumping up and down because their bike won't start. That's no fun for anybody. And in order to change out that spark plug, the bike comes with this tool right here. It's a little bit thicker wall. The Nihilo tool is a little bit thinner, a lot easier this multi-tool you can get from Nihilo makes it a lot easier to change out that spark plug. It's a little expensive, but really does come in handy for removing that spark plug a little bit quicker. Okay, on the fuel-oil ratio, I would just stick to 60-1, what the manual recommends. I don't see any other reason to deviate from that. That seemed to work well. Another quick tip on this bike with the carburetor fuel, keep your throttle adjusted with a little bit of slack there to keep your little one safe from, don't have that super tight. And then one thing that's really important on this bike is the throttle cable routing. This should be sticking up in the air a little bit. That cable, this is in the service manual, by the way. That cable is going to come up. You're going to want to go behind the coolant line. There's 2 studs on either side of the gas tank when you pull the gas tank, and that causes the problem when you put the gas tank on and off. But those two studs, make sure that cable goes under the stud and then on top of the frame, and then of course that's the only way it can really go onto the carb. But take a look at that. It's actually in the service manual. Here's an image in the service manual of that routing, again behind that coolant line and then under that stud and then on top of the frame. That's important. If you don't have it under that stud, you could pinch the cable when you put the fuel tank back on, and that causes the throttle to stick. You don't want that. You don't want that throttle sticking, of course. Jumping over to the power valve, when you take the power valve assembly apart on top of the cylinder, which you'll have to do a top end, a lot of people say they break that power valve spade, or they think it just broke from riding the bike too hard or whatever. I would argue that the reason it broke is because of when they disassembled that power valve. When you disassemble that power valve, you're going to want to put a 6mm spanner underneath the this membrane and hold that power valve shaft with the 6mm. Then there's an 8mm nut on top. I think what happens is a lot of people just grab that 8mm nut and just wrench on it, and then you break the shaft that way. That's how that's breaking. So be careful when you're taking that that nut off the top of the membrane to disassemble the power valve. Make sure you get a 6mm spanner underneath that membrane. Venting on that power valve. It comes with a little hat vent. We had problems with that. It kept falling off. I bought a new one, fell off again. I just ran a piece of tubing off the top of that power valve, a one-way check valve vent. Ran it around on top, and then down you can see that black tubing under here with the carburetor vent tubes. That seemed to work pretty well. Another thing on the power valve is when you do a top end, you'll want to clean out that power valve real well. It gets a little bit of oil in there, obviously, because it's coming off the exhaust. And this power valve is a pneumatic power valve, and what that means is the more power, the more gases, exhaust gases that flow through the pipe here. You've got this nipple, and I think on the newer ones it's a little different, but same concept. I'm not sure where it comes off the pipe, but anyway, it comes off the pipe. This piece of tubing goes over, and then it pushes up on that membrane I showed you a minute ago. And that's what opens the power valve. If you ever want to check and see if your power valve is working correctly, you can easily do that. Remove the pipe, take the two springs off the front, remove the pipe. You got to remove the silencer, two bolts to take the pipe off. And then put your finger in that exhaust port and feel that power valve spade, the bottom of that power valve spade. And then keep this black tubing on the power valve, but obviously remove it from the pipe. And then right here where my finger is, you're going to blow on this this tubing. You can pull it out. And it doesn't take much, but you can blow on that, and you can feel with your finger inside that exhaust port the power valve going up and down. And as long as a little bit of air pressure moves that power valve up, then your power valve should be working okay. If you're ever questioning that, that's a quick check that you can do to test your power valve. Also, make sure you've got some sturdy clamps on here on both ends. Obviously, you don't want any leaks on this this vent tubing here. So the clutch on this bike, we live in a fairly cold climate where I'm at, but it seems to take a while to warm up the clutch on this bike. It's obviously a hydraulic clutch. You're gonna have to pump it. We've had to pump it like 50 to 100 times to get that thing working. I tried a couple things. I replaced the guts inside the cylinder up here. I also changed out the slave cylinder, or the slave gaskets. There's a kit you can get from KTM, and still had problems. It just seems to take a while to warm up that clutch, and then bleeding that clutch. We'd bleed that fairly often, so I was stripping out this this bleeder valve here. So I got a titanium one on eBay, just a quick thing that seemed to help with that. But that clutch is going to take a second to warm up. Okay, talking about engine work on this bike, top end's pretty straightforward. One thing to note on the top end though, this is the cylinder head bolts, and you can see this one's twisted. It nearly broke, and I think it requires like 10 Newton meters to get these cylinder head bolts off. If your bike's a little bit older, or you've done maybe every 2 or 3 top ends, change out the manual recommends doing this every time, but change out these bolts every once in a while. Like I said, I didn't put a lot of force on this. This was just with the torque wrench, 10 Newton meters, and I about broke this one, which wouldn't have been fun. So it does say to change these out, and I would definitely do that. as far as bottom end goes, I did a bottom end. I did a complete engine rebuild on this bike just because I had a lot of hours. I thought maybe I should do it, and the crank is still really good. It never, so I probably didn't even need to do it, but I did. I replaced everything inside the bottom end, the transmission, bearings, all that, just to kind of to maintenance it. When you do that, if you do a bottom end, there's a deck height tool and a timing tool, which is kind of handy. Keep that in mind. To set your deck height, you will need, Vertex makes a complete gasket kit that comes with all these different thicknesses of the head gasket. I think there's a 0.20, so 0.40, 0.50, 0.60. I've got 3 of them here. I'm missing one because it's probably on the bike. You can combine those different thicknesses. I've got a little chart here, 0.5, 0.6, and 0.1 millimeter increments. This one I settled on a 0.7. Set the deck height with this Nihilo tool on this side, not this side. This side's for the timing. Just a quick note on that. I did originally buy the Rocky Mountain or the Tusk tool. I don't think it was milled correctly by Tusk, and I had some serious issues. I couldn't figure out why the bike wouldn't run it. The compression was way too low. I had way too much squish. It took me a day to figure that out. Finally, I went and bought the Nihilo tool, set my deck height with the Nihilo tool, and the bike ran great. So I think KTM or Rocky Mountain may have addressed that by now, but keep that in mind. When you set your timing, make sure you're looking at the little arrow and the little hash mark on the flywheel, and get that set correctly. There's a little arrow and a little line. Make sure you're looking at that flywheel correctly when you do this, and set your deck or your timing. So this tool is really handy when you do a bottom end. You may want to check that when you do a top end as well. Kind of nice to have. Okay, talking about the drive chain, this Nihilo tool, again, it's kind of spendy, but I wish they'd make these for more bikes. I love this, the way you adjust this chain. It's a little bit difficult without this, but you're going to stick that right behind the chain slider and then pull up on the chain. It's hard to do with one hand, but you get the idea. You're going to pull that up. And I was putting it on the looser end of the chain, because this chain, I know chains don't necessarily stretch, but we were stretching out a lot of chains, having it on the tighter end. And once I kind of adjusted that on the looser end, it seemed we weren't going through as many chains as quickly, or having to adjust the chain nearly as often. So this is great. This is a great little tool. I love that just for the chain adjustment alone. And then taking the spark plug off makes it a lot easier. On the drive itself, Loctite your sprocket bolts. We lost a few of those. That goes for any KTM really. But those, you want to check that. The countershaft sprocket, the front sprocket, there's a flange. The manual recommends that flange facing in on the bike. I would disagree, and so would a lot of other people if you read like KTM talk. I don't think that's right. And when I had the flange facing in, the chain was sticking out well past this case saver, and things just didn't line up right. And then if you look down the chain and spin the wheel, you could see that it was off. So I think they got that wrong in the manual. That flange should be facing out. I'm almost positive on that. I would anyway, I think that's the way it should be. Real quick, suspension on this bike. This would apply to the older ones that have the oil forks. I know the new ones are air. If you're going to take these forks apart, I tried rigging up a tool to disassemble the forks, the internals. There's nothing I could have done other than I had to purchase, Race Tech makes a tool. So if you need to change out these fork seals, you need to change the oil, that tool is kind of necessary. It's like $100 tool, which kind of sucked. But this again applies to the older oil forks. You'll need that Race Tech tool to take that apart and change that oil or change out those fork seals. On the back of the bike, keep an eye on your swing arm bearings. Take those apart and clean them really well first with WD-40. Make sure they're freed up. Make sure the sleeve inside the bearing is moving. Everything's moving. Everything's free, not sticking. and then lube them up, with grease, and then put it back together. At one point, I ended up just changing those bearings out because they get water in there fairly easily. Moving back to the shock on this bike, and this may just be for the older shocks, but this bushing on the bottom of the shock and also on the top of the shock, you can see there's a thin flange and a thick flange. You can kind of tell that this one's thinner, this one's thicker. It does matter which side you put the thin one on and the thick one. Make sure you reference the service manual for that and put it on the right side. And then also, more importantly, when you mount the shock back onto the bike, obviously this can spin either way, it just rotates. Make sure you look at the pictures in the book and see what side they have the rebound adjuster on, because that's important too. Now the thin one does go on the same side as the top, so thin, thin, thick, thick, whatever that was. Don't check that in the service manual. But again, those bushings, there's a thick one and a thin one. I didn't mount them correctly at one point. I also put too much grease on these seals. It pushed out. It was rubbing against the swing arm. We actually broke a shock. So keep that in mind. Those bushings, there's a thick and a thin. Very important. Real quick, brakes on this bike. They're formula brakes. Not super crazy about the formula brakes. I ended up going with some metal pistons from Judd Racing in the UK. That seemed to help a little bit. I also assembled the guts inside here one time wrong. There's a circlip, and there's two recesses in here. Make sure that circlip goes in the furthest one back, that second back recess. Well, otherwise, you're going to have some issues with the brake. That first recess back is just for the rubber boot that covers that to keep dirt and dust in there. So make sure that circlip goes back if you change out your guts inside here of that brake, and that goes for the clutch as well. A couple of quick miscellaneous items on this bike. Handlebar risers. If you're going to put some handlebar risers on here, go with the KTM ones. These are the Enduro Engineering ones. KTM ones have a flange that comes up and down and keeps that from rotating. Also, it doesn't take much. Even if your son or daughter is a little bit taller, don't get the super tall ones. I mean, this one's a 5mm on here. There's also KTM makes a 10. It doesn't take much. Even on the 85, kind of the same thing. Your son or daughter crashes a lot, your triple clamps are going to get twisted, triple clamps are going to get twisted. You're going to be doing this quite often. Undo these pinch bolts here and on the other side as well, not the top one or the fork leg will slide, but undo these two pinch bolts, the other two pinch bolts, and then compress the suspension. That might help get it a little bit straighter, but a lot of times you're going to have to get your legs in between the front wheel and tweak the handlebars the right way and get that lined up and nice and straight for them again. Did have the wheel bearings go out on this bike, so keep an eye on your wheel bearings. They're pretty cheap and easy to replace. A couple of issues that I was never able to resolve on this bike. Fuel does leak out of the drain tube, here off the bottom of the carb, a little bit. One thing that did help with that, now again, the carburetor's been completely rebuilt, the float height was set correctly, all that's good. The little needle in there is new. I bought a carb rebuild kit, so it wasn't anything to do with the float. And I've heard this online and from a lot of other people, the fuel just seems to leak from this bike a little bit. One thing that does help is if you're having a lot of problem with it and you can't get it to stop leaking. I bought a new petcock and changed that out. That seemed to help the most, but even still, it still leaks a little bit of fuel every now and then. When you're done with the bike and you put it away, turn this off so you're not sitting there leaking, wasting gas on the garage floor. The other issue I had was that I never was able to quite figure out, even after rebuilding the complete engine. I changed out the water pump bearings, the water pump shaft. I know that can get, the water pump seal. Placed all the gaskets inside the engine, and for some reason I'm still getting water inside the transmission. So when I change the tranny fluid, I've always got a little bit of water in there, and it might just be from washing the bike. It's getting in somewhere, but I completely rebuilt this engine and did everything, all the gaskets. Never could quite fix that. So I just changed the fluid fairly often. Maybe someone can comment on what that might have been. I don't think it's coming through that hat washer on the top of the power valve, or that hat vent tube. So all in all, this has been a great bike. We've enjoyed it. We're getting ready to sell it now. It's been through 2 kids of us, and I think a couple before that that raced this bike. So this bike, you know, I've had to change a lot of things out on it, but this bike runs pretty smooth. It's a 2014, and like I said, the engine's still the same as the newer ones. It's been a great bike. I think you'll enjoy it. Thanks for watching, and have fun with your son or daughter out there riding and racing.